What you just said, I mean, this is a system that has to keep expanding. You look at the debt mountain, it just keeps on growing. You start to think about, even the CBO says like this isn't sustainable. And then I look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin's this invention, and you said it closes the gap finally between the settlement speed and the settlement or transaction speed and the settlement speed. But it also kind of returns sound money principles back into the system for the digital age. And you look at Bitcoin and how it's grown over the last 14 years. How would you categorize like Bitcoin's monetization process up to this point? Like, do you like the progress so far, and how do you see it kind of evolving over the next 5 to 10 years, let's say?
I think it's been healthy progress. I mean, it's the fastest asset ever to hit $1 trillion in market capitalization, which doesn't mean as much as it would have meant 40 years ago. So it's a little bit biased, but basically, it's one of the fastest appreciating assets to go from nothing to very valuable. It's the only things that even remotely compare to it are the biggest and most successful tech companies ever. So it's been successful by any quantitative measure you can look at. I think one of the things that holds people up is the volatility. And so with most technology adoption, it's a smooth trend. So most people don't ever regress to older technology. They don't get electricity and then decide they don't want it and go back to not have electricity. They don't go from flip phone to a smartphone and then go back to flip phones again. They don't get internet access and then decide they don't want internet anymore unless they're camping or something, right? So the people rarely ever voluntarily regress unless they have like some sort of country collapse or something. And so when you look at most adoption curves, they're smooth lines up. Or sometimes they're S curves, right? But there's some sort of like very smoothness to it. A monetary technology is different, especially if it's the actual unit of account, which hasn't really happened in the modern era. And the way it's necessity going to work is basically 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because any sort of monetary asset, as it starts to monetize, is going to attract speculators. You say, well, if this thing's always going to go up, I'll just leverage it. Right. And of course, enough people do that and it doesn't always go up anymore. It has to kind of collapse and clear a lot of that out. And unlike most technologies, people do regress. They buy Bitcoin at the top and then they make 1 or 2 mistakes. They either get overexposed to it. And so they don't expect the risk of an 80% drawdown, sometimes more. And they put half their net worth in it and then they get wrecked during the bear market. And then they decide, this whole Bitcoin thing, it's dead. This makes no sense. I'm out. And so they actually go, it's like going back to not having electricity. They de-adopt the technology. Or the alternative mistake they make is they get into Bitcoin and they say, well, this other crypto is faster or it does more. And so they say, well, I'm going to start diversifying into these other cryptos. And most of them collapse and then never recover. Swan, I think you did this research. Swan did research where they looked at like the 20,000 cryptos that are out there, and they found that only like 3 of them have ever made like a higher high versus Bitcoin in the next cycle. There's kind of a ambiguity about what you kind of can include as the next cycle, but there's really only been 2 or 3 or 4 of them that have kind of been able to achieve that. And they don't really achieve it the 3rd time. And so there's been this kind of demonetization of most cryptos relative to Bitcoin. But basically, people fall into these traps. Either they get over their skis with leverage or position sizing or diversification. They get wrecked. And then they decide that this is a trap, this is a scam, this is a Ponzi scheme, which for parts of the industry is true. But for, I think Bitcoin is a very legitimate technology. I think arguably stable coins are a legitimate technology, at least for now. And so you have this kind of small number of actually utilitarian use cases and this big kind of froth built on top of it. And so I think the way that Bitcoin monetizes is necessity going to be a very kind of slow, long-term process. It's not something that happens in a decade. It's something that happens in a generation or 2. There are people born now that are like teenagers that Bitcoin was never not around for them. And so imagine what happens when people are 20 or 30 or 40 and Bitcoin's still here. If it's not hit by some crazy technical bug or it's not, like trapped by miner centralization or something, if it gets through various tests and challenges over the next couple of decades, if it's a 30 or 40-year-old network and primary wage earners and savers have never lived in an environment that doesn't have Bitcoin in a similar way that many young people today have never lived in an environment that didn't have the internet, it just becomes a more natural part of money. And the more widely held it gets, the closer it reaches to its total addressable market, the less explosive the upside is. So the less enticement there is to leverage it. Nobody can print it. So eventually over time, people realize if you hold rehypothecated Bitcoin or leveraged Bitcoin, you're probably going to lose your Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin is kind of a very credible way to potentially solve this over time. And people just have to be careful not to go over their skis. I've never been one to recommend 100% Bitcoin allocation. You have to kind of allocate based on your size and your conviction and your volatility tolerance. It's money that you should set aside that you're not going to need in 5 years, and that you're willing to kind of laugh at 80% drawdowns. But if you can handle that cost of entry, I think that's one of the most profound technologies of, at least of the 21st century.